We're here to discuss the Chinese release of Professor Zizek's book, Surplus Enjoyment. And with us here today is none other than Zizek himself, as well as Professor Xiang Biao. Professor Xiang Biao is a social anthropologist who studied at PKU, at Oxford, and now is at the Max Planck Institute. I want to introduce one conversation today. Whereas the energies of the young, the worry was in excess, right? Whether it's Christianity, it's fornication, whether it's old rulers worrying about rebellious young unmarried men. Now it seems like we should worry about the deficiency of energies of the young. Whether it's in the lie flat movement, 躺平, whether it's the fact that people in developed nations aren't having enough sex to maintain subsistence in growth rates. In this conversation, there's been two explanations that I've put forth about what is causing this erectile dysfunction of the mind, if you will. One suggestion is Xiang Biao's idea of 内卷, which Zizek brought up. And the idea here is that there's so much pointless competition, there's so much ostentatious and performative hard work that people are just so exhausted. But another explanation is what Zizek described as too much permission. It's because nothing is forbidden, is that there's too much freedom that creates a kind of loss of energy. So I wonder if we can hear some closing thoughts about what is causing the lack of energies, romantic, vocational, or otherwise, in young generations. And maybe we'll begin with Zizek.
Okay, maybe I will not answer you directly, but I find your question very precise. I think this lack of energy is at least in some way connected with the exploding, rising role of digital space, artificial intelligence in our daily lives. I will connect this with the extremely important, again I return to it, role of Nei Zhuang and so on, this hyperactivity. And here, this is very important because, it's not for me the problem just that we are not agents enough active. At some sense, what we are missing, what is disappearing, is something that I cannot but call authentic passivity. Not just hyperactively appropriate.
Leisure.
Yeah, but leisure in the sense of being really open to the others. For example, in my small decadent country, Slovenia, there is an elite circle of intellectuals which go to galleries, visual exhibitions. But they don't go there to enjoy the painting of statues. This is the task of the curator. They go there just to debate the meaning of this, that, and so on. The notion elaborated by my Austrian friend, and Biao, I think maybe he already knows him, should read him, my Austrian friend Robert Faller developed a wonderful category of interpassivity. It's not that I'm passive and the other does the work for me, it's that I am hyperactive and I transfer onto another my passive experience. Like my elementary experience of this, I love it, is ridiculous case, I use it often, but it's difficult today. I think that the greatest contribution of American culture to world culture in the 20th century is something horribly vulgar. I hope you don't have it in China. It's so-called canned laughter. You watch a TV series and the laughter is part already of the soundtrack. And maybe I am an idiot, but for me and for my friends it works. You sit like an idiot, you just stare, maybe I even work on a computer, and the TV screen even laughs, has a passive reaction for me, so that at the end I feel relieved. It's almost mystical experience. The other can assume the passive experience. So I would say that the way out of this deadlock of Nei Zhuang is also authentic passivity, not in the sense of inactive, in the sense of opening to the other, not just bombarding him with demands. The second point I would say this is that I'm not surprised, maybe these are false data, by some measures of IQ which show that from 2010 humanity all around is getting a little bit more stupid and so on. Because the problem I find with Chat GPT, we are not idiots. When you have a dialogue with Chat GPT, you know well that it's a machine. But we have a situation that my friend Alenka Zupancic developed in her book as disavowal, the French phrase, je sais bien mais comme men. I know it's a fake, a machine, but nonetheless I can enjoy the conversation. My wife sometimes spends hours chatting with ChatGPT, and he tells me, you know, it's at least more friendly than you. It always answers kindly and so on and so on. And let me go to the end in this direction. For example, probably even most of my Chinese readers, listeners know, but it's my favorite joke of story, rather. I used it 10 times in my books on how sex will soon look. You don't even need a machine to interact with you. You have a date. You take with you, you can buy them, it's disgusting in the West, a kind of a artificial vagina. You connect it to electricity, you put your penis in and it shakes, it masturbates you. Then for women you have these dildos, plastic penises, no? So what's the ideal date for me? I make a date, we meet at my place, then we both connect our machines to electricity, we put plastic penis into plastic vagina, and we hear the buzzing of the machines. And we say, okay, the other is enjoying for us, and maybe it's nice, then we can have nice talk without any pressure to enjoy and so on. Of course, there are problems here. To make 2 steps further here, and then I will conclude. You know what I'm really afraid of? Okay, maybe. I read a couple of days ago even, that in China, and this is not a reproach, you have to do it because everybody is doing it. You also presented publicly the first example of what Elon Musk called Neuralink. This idea of a direct link of your flow of thoughts with a machine. I think that we are still at the first phases, but nonetheless, things at a modest level already function. Here I see the true threat of becoming post-human, where you lose not your privacy, I don't care about privacy, but you lose your inner flow of thoughts. It's directly transparent to the other, to the one who controls. And here I see a big problem, and to go into my usual obscene topic, this will ruin sex. Sex is not just act, sex is also gentle flirting, procedure. If I can see how your thoughts are, we just look at each other. And then we immediately know, I would do it, me also, okay, let's go to bed or what. It's an incredible vulgarity. Now, just to conclude 2 maybe more problematic points. I have no illusions about we are more intelligent than machines. Would you agree or not? This will be my next book, that I see 2 things, and I spoke with specialists, that I doubt if AI machines can do it. Maybe they will, not now. Small things, not mega complex thinking. First, small rituals. You know how many people have these rituals? For example, if you walk on a floor with square stones, you automatically develop there must be at least 2 stones between one step and next step. You start to follow certain rules of these stupid daily rituals. They have no meaning. They just introduce a certain empty meaning, like there is an order, and this may surprise you. The second one, can artificial intelligence swear? swear in the sense of cursing, using dirty words. Of course, they can if you put this into a problem. But you know, swearing, using dirty words, Jacques Lacan, my teacher, says this is something very fundamental to human language. It doesn't just mean I cannot do this, I'm angry. It means I'm angry because I don't even have the words to properly express my displeasure. So I think here things get here very complex. My general conclusion is maybe artificial intelligence will think in some way, but we shouldn't compare what will maybe emerge with our human thinking. It will be at a totally different level. Just so that we don't run out of time, my last question to provocative, to Professor Biao, now I'm aggressive, consciously, Professor Biao, is it not that what you call Juan, or people call, that is to say, this fake hyperactivity, how do you relate this to what I follow in China and find pretty interesting? I know the same thing happens already in parts of the United States, in South Korea, in Japan. What I think you call, I'm sorry if I will mispronounce it, Bai Lam, let it rot. This withdrawal into passivity. Let's not engage. Don't you think there is a certain parallel between this fake hyperactivity and this withdrawal into this let it rot, the system, do nothing? And it's a great problem.
Great. So the Jonathan question about the lack of energy or the powerlessness of the young, it really brings Slavage's thinking and my thinking actually very nicely. My answer is very simple. What causes the lack of energy? One word, the lack of gaps. Because we feel that we have a life force, we have vitality, we take action and etc. We can imagine it is because there is a space that we can act on. And there is certain void that we can fill with our actions. And by doing so, the world will give us some responses. If you live in a situation that is you totally identify with, if you live like in a prison, all the walls are iron and it's padded with cotton because they want to avoid your suicide, then everything is sealed. If there is no gap, actually you cannot act. So actually, Slavage just give us some very interesting examples of what I mean by a gap. For instance, the lying flat or let rot, which are, I think, concrete examples of what Jonathan referred to, the lack of energy of the young. And that is, you are right, Slavage, you are right. Structurally, it's really parallel with the excessive competition and hyperactivity because neither of them will provide the actors a sense of gap. Hyperactivity and this involution nature is totally identified with the system, and they follow the system, force themselves to work very hard, and then the lying flat let rot is a total withdrawal to say, I'm step out from the system as if there's nothing left in this world. Therefore, either mode is sustainable for me, is practical because of the lack of gaps. Then, Jonathan, as you mentioned, Slavage, the critiques of this liberal or neoliberal system based on this, in a way, it's a principleless permissiveness, which actually gives no gap. Basically, you can do anything. But of course, in his book brilliantly demonstrates that how the general permissiveness actually lead to a prohibition of every specific actions, which make actions almost impossible in concrete sense. Then in my empirical study, the differences is really, I think, empirical because we focus on different cases. It's either Western, more ideological domain, or it is Chinese everyday life and political economy. In my case, what I see is this kind of tightly organized, excessive competition, but with the same result, meaning there is no gap. No? So the both lead to the same problem of the lack of gap. And the lack of gap can also be demonstrated by the fact that when you say young people have no energy, they even don't, looking for romance, let alone getting married or having children. It's not because they are completely doing nothing. No, they are very, very busy. If you chart, how many hours they work and how many hours they have for their own sleep, you will see there is a widespread sense of exhaustion. So why they are so busy, yet they feel they have no energy? It's not simply because the business, the activity, the action per se consumed their physical energy. No, because their business, what does this being busy mean? This being busy is basically force them to identify themselves without any gap with the system. So their business is not only doing something, doing tasks, their business is to eradicate the gap between them and the system, the gap between this type of thinking and the other type of thinking. So there's basically no kind of experiential contradiction left, even though the systemic contradiction looms large. So in this sense, therefore we have this paradox, being very busy but being powerless. So final point, what should we do? I think therefore this we all come together. So I'm so glad to have this opportunity to talk to Slavoj, is to rediscover this gap and think carefully how we can cultivate this gap and make the gap a productive one. But whether or not this gap is associated with the level 0 or void, as the notion of subjective destitution imply, or is a gap can be found in the nearby, in certain attitudes in everyday life, which actually have something to do with the Confucius idea of cultivation, etc. I think that is a really open question. I would suggest that different people can try different ways and see which way works well in what contexts, and then as theorists we can come back, try to generate a broader picture which may in turn guide people to next step of action. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Zizek, and thank you, Xiangbiao, for a fascinating conversation. I'll hand it over to Zizek to discuss Zizek's new book.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor for me, this debate with my good colleague and friend Biao, for two reasons, two things I find extremely important, and I really mean it. It's not that I fully agree, but it gives me ideas. I can steal from him, honestly, take his ideas. One is his notion of, I don't know how to pronounce it correctly in Chinese, nearby. He correctly locates in the disintegration of this notion of nearby one of the basic components of a social crisis today. That's first. And second, his identification of a certain subjective stance, I'm sorry for mispronouncing it, that he calls nejuan, this kind of empty, empty in the sense that you don't see meaning in it, but nonetheless you think that if you are hyperactive in some cause of external success and so on, even sex, that you will get at some meaning, and the result is even deeper meaninglessness, and to be frankly, in the domain of sexuality, even less sex. So let me briefly begin. In the United States Constitution, at the very beginning, they say all people independent of race, which is obviously not true, and so on, have the inalienable right to the search of happiness. I simply disagree with it. And that brings me to what I call surplus enjoyment. I think that human basic psychological stance is much more paradoxical, self-sabotaging. What we officially want is part of the pleasure. Not only this, but pleasure itself, or even sexual enjoyment, it more and more becomes a superego pseudo-moral injunction order. Imagine a family is for a long time preparing, it happened to me when I was young, a big holiday, and then when you arrive there, the weather is bad, you cannot enjoy, and then father or a figure of authority tells you, we spent so much time preparing this, now you have to enjoy, you know. That's our reality today. It's a beautiful paradox, because at least in the West, but as far as I know also in China, for example, sexuality is getting more and more permissive. But the result is paradoxical. It's not that you can freely enjoy it. No, sexuality gets more and more as an obligation. You feel guilty, not as in old times for illicit sexuality, you feel guilty for not enjoying. Or the other big paradox in the West. They say permissivity, you can do, that's not my view, with 5 people at the same time, with animals, whatever you want. But at the same time, sexuality is so much regulated by so-called politically correct rules. Yes, I can do it with dogs, with cows, whatever you want. But if I treat another human being slightly in a wrong way, touch him or her in a way which is not allowed, I am instantly excluded, cancelled, pronounced guilty. So isn't this a beautiful paradox? What appears absolute permissivity gets caught in a whole series of prohibitions. So let me not talk too long. The basic paradox is this one. Let's say you have some basic desire, which is prohibited. But then, all of a sudden, you start to enjoy the prohibition itself. This is what obsessional neurotics do. They don't dare to realize their desire, but they enjoy the very rituals of prohibiting that stage the punishment for their desire. So again, enjoy is today not a call for liberation. Enjoy is another strong superego injunction. So our goal today, and this is subtly connected with what my friend Biao already hinted at, today our fight should not be enjoy without obstacles and so on. It should be you are not obliged to enjoy. This doesn't prohibit enjoyment. It just says you don't have to be obliged to enjoy. Where are here paradoxes? Now comes a problematic part, and I will soon end up. I often mention this in some of my books, maybe it's even in Surplus Enjoyment. I read a comment of a British commentator who watched a hard pornography movie where a guy is in front of the camera doing it to a woman. Then in the middle of this, he steps back and says, I'm losing erection, please give me my iPhone so that I look at pornographic images. But this is total perversion. You have there a woman naked, you are doing it to her, and you still need images. You know, this is surplus enjoyment. These images that you need. I'm jumping up and down, but I would now even apply this to very important notion, also mentioned, debated by my friend Biao, Nei Juen. It's not just that you are unhappy in this hyperactivity. Yes, you feel miserable, but I think in a perverted, secret way, you enjoy it. You enjoy it. That's the mystery of surplus enjoyment, how precisely. Let me conclude with a very simple example. I'm jumping, I know, with my mother. We often asked her to go to some store far away when I was younger to bring us something. And she always complained how I'm tired. Then once I said, I don't need you to do anything. And she was desperate. She said, now I'm totally useless. And so what she complained about, she secretly enjoyed it. I think we should take into account all these paradoxes of human desire, its self-sabotaging nature, which is why, again, back to Professor Biao, yes, we cannot return to old authoritarian system, but what we call today permissivity, paradoxically brings an even worse terror, with tightly regulated rules and so on. So, just to conclude, this is a very important point, and then I will shut up. My friend Biao, when you mentioned these big other rules which are disintegrating, you know, what, as you probably know, fascinated me absolutely always, is that these rules are never just rules. You always have, I call them meta-rules, rules which tell you, do you really have to literally respect the rules, or are you not only allowed, but even expected to silently violate these rules? And this, I think, is falling apart today in a model way in Trump's America. What Trump is doing is that he does not only, he basically respects the legal rules, more or less, but he systematically violates the implicit unwritten rules. He speaks publicly in a vulgar way, there is no decency in what he is doing, and so on and so on. And that's, for me, the true horror.
Great. I want to start our discussion by what Professor Zizek began the discussion with about Xiang Biao's discussion of rebuilding the nearby. And for our audience, this idea is that modern individuals have become so alienated that they only care about two different spheres of life. One is their immediate selves and their immediate family, and the other is the grandest possible kind of world historic events, be it climate change, be it, communism, or just global capitalist events. And what is missed is this nearby, which is this middle sphere of your communities, of the schools and the parks that nourish your neighborhood, and that is what is missed. But I think this is in a tension with Zizek's thought, because Zizek has often warned that this middle layer of focusing on local political community action can distract us from those greater goals like climate change and capitalism and thinking big ideas that we actually need. So help me reconcile this. Professor Biao, why don't you give the first take here?
Okay. So thank you. That links nicely to what Slavoj just, now I sometimes call you Zizek, sometimes call you Slavoj. I think
call me whatever you want, just don't call me professor.
Okay, but this is really indicate the developing relationship between us, not because it's our first direct conversation, but yet I feel I'm, of course, familiar with your work, but after reading your book, I feel there is a deep resonance between us. So sometimes you have a public figure out there, Zizek. Sometimes I feel you are a person that I feel so fortunate that I will be able to think with. So they are Slavoj. So there's then related to the nearby, I think the tension or the possible way to put them together, I would say that I see more commonalities than tensions, Jonathan. Why is that? There's two things here. The two things actually directly drive from Slavoj just said now. Number one is a question of related to the question of gap. And actually in your book, Slavoj, you actually gave good analysis because Trump is the return of the repressed. The return of repressed is not to go back to address the big others, the symbolic order need to be reformed, but they say, okay, I'm almost a naked person. I have been repressed by the big other, so therefore now I want to get rid of all these rules, all these norms, and I just speak out so-called authentically and related to other repressed people directly. What is the consequences here? When the students in the 1968, when they speak out in the language to say, oh, we want to be rebellious, we want to completely open, they are talking to a gap between a quite rigid structure, norms out there, conservative social order on one hand, and the individual desire to be free, to explore, to be adventurous about their life, and to be authentic to their dreams, and etc. Because there is a gap there, so therefore the student's voice is a voice for me, is energizing, is mobilizing, and also enable us to see more clearly about the gap. And this gap, or the awareness of the gap, and the action, try to fill the gap, provide positive surplus enjoyment. But now Trump started talking. And again, I think this is because Trump is speaking in the historical context in the 2020s. It's 50 years after, more than 50 years after 1968, after neoliberalism, after multiple imperialist wars, and etc. So the old conservative, rigid social norm has already been replaced by this liberal and neoliberal permissive social order. Right? As your analysis has already pointed this out. In this historical context, when Trump speaks, there is no structural gap here anymore because there's already a very widely permissive order, social. The symbolic order and the big other has already been integrated, and so therefore he speaks as a naked person, as an individual. True, probably is very authentic as a person. He is speaking out what he desires directly, but this is not balanced or contextualized in the concrete social environment now. And so therefore, there is a historical irony why the same words will have completely different political implications now. So this is one gap. Then why is that related to nearby? Then the question is, okay, the gap sounds very concrete, but so far our analysis about the gap is based on quite structural and theoretical analysis. How do people, you and I, individuals, experience this gap in everyday life? Nearby is a quite practical instrument for us to experience this gap. Okay, I feel that way, and I look at my neighbors. I don't like my neighbors, but my neighbor is there. I cannot wish my neighbor away. I can wish American politics away. I can wish Gaza away, but simply by turning off my mobile phone, but I cannot wish my neighbors away. And what is this gap? Maybe my neighbor has his or her own good reasons to behave this way. And when I go all out, if I'm a young people, I feel the older people, cast a particular gaze on me, and how should I handle this, and etc. So this a very concrete understanding or feeling about the gap, I think it's very important at this current moment to reestablish a sense of subjecthood. And secondly, very briefly, nearby is related to Slavic thinking, I think has something to do with the question of attachment vis-a-vis enjoyment. Here is a question for you, Slavic. You said, like in this excessive competition, or like even the performance of erotic action in front of camera, you need image. You don't take enjoyment from the thing itself, but you take enjoyment by taking the ritualistic performance of doing so. That part give your enjoyment. The competing with other people is painful, but the competition itself as a form, as a way organize life, give you a sense of enjoyment. This I slightly disagree purely on the ground of empirical experiences. People probably don't feel that is sense of enjoyment, but they keep doing it. Why? attachment. Then attachment, then can we say attachment is the sense that if they don't live life in the form of competition, they don't know what would be other viable form of living they can adopt, which will give them sense of meaning. So therefore, sometimes then I call it a double alienation. Sometimes they do force themselves to do something they hate because they feel the act that they are forcing themselves to do is an act of agency and gives some sense of meaning to their life. And this kind of meaningfulness of self-punishing, self-denial, for me is attachment because they cannot get away from that and they fear. They fear if they lose the competition, if you step out from this form of life, there's nothing left for them in this world. So then it's different from enjoyment, not only because experientially attachment is associated with a sense of fear, with a sense of sometimes despair, but also I feel this is has more agency because when it is attachment, they know I don't like it, but currently I cannot see other opportunities in the current situation. So I wish I can step out, but I'm waiting for the moment. But if we conceptualize as a sense of enjoyment, as if this kind of layer of awareness become elusive to the analysts as well as to themselves. So this is why I wonder whether attachment is more accurate than enjoyment in order to describe why they keep forcing themselves to do something they don't like. And that's related to the nearby too, in the sense that you pay attention to your surrounding, and then you do not develop this kind of sense of attachment to a system or to a form of life as if there is no alternative. Because in the nearby forms of life, almost by definition is heterogeneous. You know, you have different neighbors, and you have security guard, you have cleaners, and you have shopkeepers, but probably also you have some very high income groups, etc. This heterogeneity, this rich fabric of life will probably make you more committed to life itself, but probably less attached to a single model of life. So I want to hear, what do you think?
Thank you very much. This was very profound. I would just like to give you a couple of very precise answers. First, would you agree that to your vague triadic categorization, intimate life, just your narrow family and so on, not the nearby of community, then we have the nearby, and then we have the common space. What I would like to do here first is to introduce another category between the nearby, which is nonetheless people with whom you are in more or less immediate contact, and the universal causes, war, peace, ecology. There is patriotic national identity. People are forced to, it's very ambiguous. People usually say, I'm ready to die for my country. Much more than I'm ready to die, unfortunately, for ecology or whatever. This I find dangerous, because today I think would you agree with this? The result of I totally agree with you on your positive evaluation of nearby. I think this limitation to private sphere is a catastrophe. But I think at the political level, we got, and maybe this is an effect of this disintegration of authentic nearby, we get what we usually describe as neo-fascism, but South Korea has it, Japan, now I learned, a new right-wing country, look at Israel, look at Trump. That is to say, this larger ethnic community where they apply this old disgusting motto, my country, right or wrong. So you know what I mean? Where
Yeah.
I would agree with you with nearby is that nearby should also be a kind of a protective circle against the bad tendencies that penetrate, pervade all of society. Look at Israel now, where 85% of the people agree that they should clear up, throw Palestinians out of Gaza and West Bank. There are minor differences, just should we kill them, should we throw them out, and so on. I agree with you, if this would be your conclusion, that in such a situation, it's not enough to just intimately be opposed to it. You need a new form of, not in the cheap sense political, but ethico-political nearby. So that's my first point. I would say that national identity, patriotism, I don't a priori condemn it. What happened to China and India in the early 19th century, Opium War and so on, was unheard of. Based on this concrete background, you have all the right to a certain patriotism. But let me then introduce another level where I want to hear your opinion. Isn't it that what is forming on Facebook, X, Instagram, and so on, I'm totally out of it, but I see, I don't know how to characterize it. On the one hand, it is an ersatz nearby. You know, you don't have a nearby, but you build an artificial nearby. But usually it's, as you nicely said, it's not a neighbor, a nearby person with whom you are stuck with. No, it's already a certain criterion of selection. Like, if I'm a Lacanian Hegelian, I would do a group there, or why not certain sexual orientation, political orientation, quantum physics, scientific, and I am here divided. On the one hand, yes, there can also be very progressive nearbys. That's why artificial intelligence, all these forums and so on are in the West. They form an alternative community. At the same time, I agree with you that this, how do I call them, but I don't mean this in a bad sense, artificial nearbys, these digital communities, there is an element of conscious choice in it. It's not simply people you are stuck with. So I am divided here. And just, I think I would like to hear your opinion, to cut a long story short, about this artificial digital nearby communities. Just let me add something else. What you said about decency, permissivity, and so on, I agree what you said about gap, and I agree that there was a difference in content. But nonetheless, both Trump and 68 students, I'm talking at a formal level, thought that decency is somehow connected with authority, and that to be subversive, you know, we use F-word, these obscene gestures and so on, that you have to be obscene. I think that we, modern left, not those crazy politically correct or traditional left, would you agree? We should discover decency, respect, and so on. And would you agree? That's my paradoxical formula, maybe you know it. Compare two persons like Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders, I don't totally agree with him, but isn't this beautiful that if we mean by postmodernism, this disrespect of the gap, you are vulgar, you say you change facts, you are publicly dreaming as it were. Trump is a postmodern president in this sense, even in the way he acts, while Bernie Sanders, progressive socially, is a nice, old-fashioned, decent, moral personality. So, to go to the last point, you maybe, I don't even, after you explain it now, I'm not even sure that I disagree with you. But if I read you superficially, I think that I see one potential danger, which is that nearby can also function, especially today, in an exclusionary way. You know, nearby, all those who are close to me, but you silently exclude foreigners. Or you can do as you mentioned, you have servants or whatever from other classes, but like they remain outside in some sense. So the big problem is how to prevent what Trump is doing. Trumpian populism is for me precisely an attempt to reconstruct some kind of a nearby local people, but in a racist way, excluding some others. This is what I see as a potential danger. Please strike back.
I will say I myself am most curious about Zizek's proposal about online spaces being a kind of new nearby, but functions very differently. It is a type of community, but it functions very differently from physical communities we had before, especially given the algorithmic control that big companies sort of operate on top of these nearbys. And so would love to hear how you think about online spaces as a good or bad example of a nearby, as well as what you think, if AI will make the situation better or worse in these communities. Maybe
so just one sentence. So I agree with you, Jonathan, objectively, even if we are all friendly. We are now doing to Biao, like what they call in detective novels, this tough third-degree interrogation. We are both now confronting him with a problem, and since we are democratic, although he is already condemned, we will allow him formally to reply.
No, that's it. I think the genuine surplus enjoyment, right? Being questioning so deeply and seriously. Let me start with a question Jonathan also repeated about the virtual community. I think it's very nicely related to Slavich's thesis, actually, about constraints and the permissive culture. What is the virtual community? When the internet became publicly available from military technologies and become a public good in 1996, I think, or 1993, we remember there was an internet utopianism to say that it is really free flow information, open access, and you can really, it will be the final death toll to the authoritarianism and etc. And then it became a commercial enterprise, and we see that the internet and the platform economy became the domain where capital became concentrated in a speed and a scale unprecedented in history. Then why is the internet, what was the utopia, the internet utopianism, I think has a good basis at that time, because they said it is no limit and it's a free flow. And today, in some sense, internet is still no limit, even if there is managed and manipulated by capital and by AI. But for as an individual, it is still very free. And that for me is a problem. Because it's so free, and it's true, you can look for people who are like-minded, and you can propose all kinds of ideals, including the most progressive and beautiful ideals in the internet, as free as possible. But this form of freedom without concrete constraints, without very direct friction in everyday practice, that actually undermines the value of freedom. Isn't this also, Salvage, you argued in your book, when they become so widely permissive, in the end, what you say and what you hear, as if there is no gap between all this, but in the end of the day, is complete, in a way, it's a fake, because it cannot be grounded in everyday practice. So therefore, I think I have a quite a strong opinion in this regard. I want to say that the nearby must, by definition, physical nearby. It means your neighbors, your security guards in the condominium, which is a common way of living in Chinese cities, and the people clean your street and etc. And because this is a constraint, of course, compared to the virtual world, your nearby is most constrained space, the limited number of people, limited space, and etc. But the whole point is that try to find a world in this nearby and think very concretely what you can do to this familiar stranger. For instance, the person who's selling vegetables, every day, 4 o'clock afternoon, he will appear on the street corner selling fruits. No? Very familiar, but you have no idea who he is. How do you face this one individual in front of you? And don't think about the global condition too far away. And what are you going to say? To what extent you can really understand him? And to what extent you will say something really meaningful for him? They're very, very concrete, specific actions. And that type, you are completely free at this moment. For instance, if you found out he has a problem, are you willing to help? Or you think this form of help wouldn't do any good in the long term for him or his family, and etc. You have full freedom at this moment to make a decision, and you have to be responsible for that action, that choice, and that is genuine freedom. So therefore, I wanted to emphasize the virtual community. Of course, it's a still valuable instrument if we want to exchange ideas, we want to do social mobilization, etc. Of course, we should not deprive ourselves of these digital technologies and the tools, but existentially, I think it is critical now. We have to reground our life back to the physical nearby. So now let me touch on the 3 other points that Slavoj mentioned. Number 1 is about the question of whether or not a nearby can become exclusive and the nearby can become a prototype of a narrow nationalism. As J.D. Vance, the vice president of the US, he was citing the nearby, not citing my theory, but he was talking about nearby when he justified why the US government should cut down the US aid program. He said, it's just human nature. You have to look after your own neighbor, your family, and your neighbor, your own citizen first. And why should the US government, support all this clean water in Africa, all this children's education in Latin America, etc. And he was talking about as if it's a commonsensical notion of the nearby. So that's, of course, we should be aware of the danger that this theory can be misappropriated by this ideology. But nevertheless, let me make 2 points on this question. Why there is such a rapid rise of far right? And I'm now in Germany, and actually I'm now in a city where AfD is quite active. And one of the reasons that they say, we have to go back to our land, we have to go back to our authentic life, is because the mainstream discourse over the last 40 years and after the end of the Cold War has been dominated by quite abstract notions about the faraway. Some lofty progressive principles. For many ordinary people, they feel they are kind of become outcast of this global elite discourse. So this is why they are so resentful of globalization. Why should globalization, what did the globalization do to them? Any harm do to them? Probably materially, not much. But discursively, they feel that their grounded everyday life, their struggle is being ignored by the discussion and emphasis on this global discourse, quite abstract principle. So this is the number 1 thing, and I think if we can develop a more robust and a more grounded discourse about the nearby and move away from this empty liberal abstract discourse, it could be actually addressing a root cause of the rising of far right. This is number 1. Number 2 is by paying attention to the nearby does not mean that you forget the far away and let alone excluding the far away. Paying attention to the nearby is precisely to develop a method, to develop a type of capacity to understand how the world society is constituted in a concrete way. And this is, we met many students, right? The reason I was start thinking of nearby had something to do with my teaching experiences in Oxford. When I ask students tell me about their research project, and I will find some students just can tell the research project and topic in a much more lively, vivid way, and in a way that you can see the student will deepen his or her thought if more material become available and etc. Because the student always ask very concrete, this thing happened, there must be three factors working, the three groups, their interests are conflict each other, and therefore, so that there's a two possible outcome will emerge, and etc. And then you have other type of students who just very rigid and empty, very formalic, and somehow repeating similar statements, and the way they carry themselves forward is by logical reasoning rather than by absorbing new materials and put them into a new picture. And that I found that there are differences between the two types of students. The former one, who can think and describe about the world in a more vivid way, often have a much more interesting and a concrete and vivid account about his or her own life. He can tell you, my grandparents are like this and this, and migrated somewhere, and my parents are like that, then I grew up in this, my hometown is like that, neighbors are like this. And they have the capacity of putting their life in an interesting and revealing picture, starting from their own personal life, starting from their own nearby. And the second type of students very typically cannot give a concrete and a clear account about their own life, their parents, neighbors, and nearby. So I think actually that is a question of thinking capacity. So the nearby for me, it is very pedagogical, because the nearby as a unit, as a geographical or political unit, it's very elusive. You cannot do much by hanging on the nearby as a physical space, but the nearby can be a classroom, can be a laboratory, and can be kind of a form of art. What do I mean by that? Because you can use that to exercise your eyes. You're going to train your accessibility. You can train the way you talk to people. And with that, you will have a more concrete and more, I would say sometimes more a skeptical view about all these big messages being circulated in the social media, because you can smell there's something else beneath this big message, beneath these very simple stories. And this is to make you related to the far away in a more concrete manner. So basically, this is my kind of justification of the nearby. I will stop here, but there are other questions that we can come back later.
I would like to reply a little bit, because I found very interesting.
Well, I would want for you to reply, but this is the part of your guys' thought that I want to sort of deepen the screw and drive the wedge across. Because what I'm hearing from Professor Biao is, we need to focus on the nearby, this kind of middle area, and it's those big global messages that are the issue. Whereas from Zizek, I'm hearing something different. It's the global messages we have been hearing, whether it's political ideology, or political correctness, or transgender or homosexual LGBTQ. It's the type of big global message that's wrong. But Zizek's exhortations are still to think big and still to think on a global scale, whether it's around global capitalism, right? So there is a tension, I think, between your guys' thought here.
You will not know, again, you want to split us. You want to introduce a split between progressive forces. So let me answer you briefly. No, I read Biao, my friend, not professor, my friend Biao, in a little bit more refined way. Did I get correctly or wrong? Let's take ecology. I see here a tension between the state, patriotic unity, where they de facto do nothing, and my wager is that nearby, your circle, for which ecological trouble can be a very empirical experience, flooding, my ideal is what old Marxists would have called dialectical unity of particular and universal. That you should make ecological crisis not some abstract notion, but link it to your concrete experience. I cannot even go out, there is flooding, we don't have water. Why establish here a direct link to a global issue, not fully trusting your state, which can do its own play? But another question, you know where maybe there is a difference? I think it's more in subjective attitude. I'm a little bit more pessimist in the sense that I had experiences, what you, Biao, said about this. Let's say you live in an upper class gated community, no? But do you know, I regularly experience this, because now I will tell you something that will surprise you. I am in one thing I am good, forget theory, in establishing, maybe even through vulgar jokes, contact with ordinary people, servants, and so on. And they are well aware of how, when they work for a rich family, they are treated in a formally polite way, but there is a kind of a fake friendliness, which in some sense excluded their true inner world even more. First point. Second point, you know, when you said understanding the other and all that stuff, but I think that it's a very problematic point. I repeat it in my work. I ask you that if you experience how your other, whoever, partner, sees the world from his, her, their own perspective, this can also be a lie. Inner truth can be a lie. If you look at Nazi criminals or some, they can have an inner story full of fictions, like many Israelis now feel that they're just fighting for survival and so on and so on. For me, your inner experience can also be a lie covering up horrors that you are doing, committing in social reality. But here again, nearby helps, because nearby there can be more truth in nearby, in how you effectively treat your neighbors, than in your stupid, shitty inner experience or what. Last thing, now I come to the maybe, to give some satisfaction to our reactionary counterpoint, Jonathan, where there is maybe a gap that I see. First, would you agree, when you talk, I admire this double alienation and so on. First, would you agree with my old analysis that this alienation, I see it at three levels? First, we have simple alienation. Let's say you work in a stupid classical factory, repeat all the day the same mechanic gesture. It's horrible, but at least it, in some sense, leaves your mind free to dream about freedom, sex, art, whatever you want. Then you have something which is ambiguous in the sense that it's very nice ethically, but it can also be oppressive. Let's say that, and we are approaching that era with many old people, you work in this health caring field. There you are not only, if you are human and not a pig, you are not only expected to change the diapers, whatever, of these helpless old people, you are expected to show a certain kindness, smile at them, but this is also, you know, you must fake for a good cause. I would fake. You would like to strangle that older woman? No, I'm a human being, I will be kind to her. And then here I think your idea of Juan enters. What you are describing, I agree, as double alienation, is, I think, the worst alienation. Why? Because it's not just I'm doing something, I don't identify it. You know what would be for me the ultimate nightmare? To be I have, let's say, to participate in some scientific management board where we debate how to do new inventions to exploit people. I find it disgusting, but I don't only have to participate. To succeed, I really have to mobilize my mind, be active. That's the ultimate thing. It's not that your creativity is squashed. It's that you have to be hyperactive, collaborating, but for a horrible cause. And my last point, now comes the provocation. What I like in your notion of nearby is that, yes, I don't want to be friends with all people. I don't think I am a fascist if I say this is my circle. I don't want to kill others, I want to take care of them, but I don't like this politically correct, however you call it, stance that the further the suffering is, the more you should sympathize. This logic of how can you care with the poor neighbor of yours if people are starving in Somalia? Like the further they are, all the better. There is something fake in this. I am ready to help people all around the world. But I don't want even to understand. I'm ready to help others even if I don't fully understand. We never fully understand even ourselves. In this sense, now comes my provocation. I wouldn't like to, some leftists in the West believe in it, in this self-management, small communities where you don't only work, but every afternoon you meet, you debate schooling, water supply. No, I like to have a certain distance, not total immersion into your social circles.
Slavish, your global scale of thinking and how that related to nearby as a lens, not necessarily as a physical scope where problems are confined, but as a lens through which we see larger pictures. And let me focus on this, the climate change first, then I'll go back to the second question, the nearby as a unit. You said that you don't want to go to the neighborhood meeting every afternoon. So the climate change is a very good example, and let's go back to the question of Bernie Sanders and Trump. And you said that the Bernie Sanders type of message is what we need, and Trump is, of course, the biggest concern for people like us. But there is a huge real challenge in front of us. That is, Bernie Sanders is not being heard by many people, at least in the US. So then the question is that then Trump's voice is so loud, right? So there's a various, then go back to the climate question too, because for us, people like us, there is no disputes about what climate scientists say, but then the question is that why such obvious, self-evident phenomenon is not taken seriously, and then it was even declared as lie by Trump, and furthermore, such a denunciation has been accepted by many people. So what concerned me is not about the global message per se in the content, but also the method and how the message circulates, and especially how that will capture people's mind and heart. In other words, the social effect of a message. So it's not only about the big other, the symbolic order, as it is staying out there, but is also how the big other and the symbolic order come into everyday life, come into people's minds. So then climate change is a global issue. But now we face the real dilemma, and this as a global issue, we cannot somehow is not appealing to many people. So my formula is like as following. Number one, of course, we should repeatedly remind people there is such real danger of climate change. And number two, pointing to all kinds of, as you mentioned, very concrete incidents of this weird and unpredictable weather conditions, water pollutions, air pollution, a very concrete situation in their neighborhood. And I have observed actually things like one type of flower suddenly bloomed much earlier than usual will trigger very deep public consciousness in a particular city or even neighborhood, much more than what a climate scientist will say. Because that kind of flowers, the fact that it bloom unseasonally, is often associated with all kinds of mystical imaginaries and discourse. There's a culturally rich phenomenon there. And for me, that is a type of resources that the human society has, how to interpret all this kind of odd phenomenon. And if we pay attention to that type of changes, and even not necessarily link that to global conditions, and that event itself will work on people's consciousness, remind the people that the current situation is problematic, is not sustainable, and I have already witnessed that type of consciousness really make people to think situations more critically and more willing to examine the way how they live and how they work. So therefore you lead to all kind of you can say quiet resignation or quiet quit moment and lie flat and etc. It has something to do with the consciousness that the world, the climate, the nature can no longer sustain the current mode of living. So again, it's not to, I don't think there is a dichotomy or contradiction between the far away, like the global system, and the nearby. But the question is not only think the scientist is to tell truth, a global truth to people, but much more important than global truth is the concrete consciousness. What will trigger them to have a sense, oh, our way of living is problematic. How exactly problematic, etc. That takes time for people to come to that point. So that is the question of climate change and local consciousness, because local consciousness is the true starting point of local action. So then the neighborhood organization and whether or not nearby must entail a very confined and strong solidarity among people living nearby. No, for me, actually, I think we're very similar persons. We don't want to go to committee meetings every day to discuss how we'll manage a rubbish system. I would rather to have division of labor, some expert will take care of all that. But for me, another, the nearby, the physical manifestation of nearby is multiple. For instance, on the subway, your car is your nearby. The nearby is different from community or different from place. Very different, because a nearby is always your nearby. When you move, your nearby move. So it's not like a neighborhood or community which you can point out in a physical map. Your nearby cannot. When you go to work and your nearby is in your office, when you go to the airport, actually at that moment your nearby is the airport, then do observe. What kind of people are flying? What kind of people take EasyJet? What kind of people take business class? And how people manage their family relations? Suddenly some people start quarreling when they're queuing. And why is that? And for many young people, that kind of things are something really evade their attention. So nearby is your nearby. It is really the landing point about the idea of the nearby is a perspective, is your attention. And fundamentally, actually, is a question of subjectivity. How you develop a type of subjectivity that is rooted firmly and concretely in social relations. Yeah. So, I mean, it is a great pleasure. I mean, I don't know whether or not the pleasure is the right word. Probably I should say, I expect this to be a great surplus enjoyment in the sense that we know it is hard work to do, and I know that in the process of doing the hard work, discussing with Slavoj, we will have disagreement, gaps, and that will give sense of satisfaction. This book, Surplus Enjoyment, is deeply meaningful for me. Probably I just speak from my own perspective as one reader, for two reasons. Number one is as all Zizek's work has shown, what he wants to do is to provide a new set of tools for general public to think about their experiences in unusual, provocative, and productive and probably upsetting and destabilizing ways. So therefore, the book is not about to argue or debate with past philosophers or psychoanalysts in order to advance so-called scientific knowledge or philosophical thought per se. But the point is to deliver new tools that is needed for our time and by large section of populations. And this is exactly what we at the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Halle want to do. And the second thing I found is also very close to what I have been thinking is that Professor Zizek in this book somehow becomes more moderate than before, even though intellectually he always radical, but more moderate in the sense of the type of messages that he wants to deliver to the public. He emphasized again the importance of decency. He emphasized the importance of constraints, the necessity to impose constraints on ourselves. And at the end, he argued for the self-subjective destitution, which I don't fully understand. We probably that's the point to discuss the sense of self. How can we reconstitute subjecthood in our times now? But in any case, I think this effort to review how these general, broad social norms are shaping us, creating lots of obstacles for our freedom, and at the same time try to rework, to re-establish, reconstitute a general, what he calls the big other, following Lacan, the big other, the symbolic order. And that is, for me, reflection, but more importantly, very timely. And what we face today is, both in West and in other societies, including China, is a sense of nihilism, as if nothing can be said, no big order, no large horizon that we can envision that will give sense to our being. And yet, it's certainly there's no way for us to return to old religion, to old orthodox, and etc. And in this kind of a void, almost you can say ruin. I mean, ruin in multiple senses due to recent history as well as ongoing political struggles. In the current ruin, how we can rebuild. Not necessarily a substantive consensus, but at least a common space for dialoguing, a common space where we respect decency, respect the basic kindness, then move forward. I think that is really encouraging for me. I mean, I'm not just sitting here praising the book, but I think it is a very important intervention, and precisely it is important intervention, therefore it raises some very serious questions that we want to debate today as well. Yeah. That would be my introduction.